Be with you.
With thy spirit.
Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So if you'll turn in your Bibles to Matthew 25, I'm glad to see that that people have repented from their sins and everybody has a Bible with them. I'm just impressed. And we're in Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25. And could I have a volunteer read through 25, 1 through 13, please?
At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they didn't take oil with them. But the wise ones took oil in their flasks with their lamps. When the groom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, there was a shout, "Here's the groom! Come out to meet him!" Then all the virgins got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise ones, "Give us some of your oil, because our lamps are going out." And the wise ones answered, "No, there won't be enough for us and for you. Go instead to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." When they had gone to buy some, the groom arrived, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the rest of the virgins came also and said, "Master, Master, open up for us." And he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore be alert, because you don't know either the day or the hour."
Okay, so we have the parable of 10 virgins, and there's something that we often do as we come to Bible studies, especially when we go through a study like this, and that is we concentrate on these 13 verses and we lose the context of where it is in the book in which it's given. So I want someone to tell me what immediately precedes the parable of the 10 virgins. Precedes. Before. Okay. And then afterwards, the talents. Now, so we're talking about what here? Both things have something in common. What would that be? Okay. Doing. They're about doing. Christianity without action is not really Christianity at all. Now, that's not just me saying it. James says faith without works is dead. Right? You can't have action without faith, can you? That's no longer Christianity. It's something else. So right in between these, the center of this sandwich is this parable of the 10 virgins, and that gives us a clue of what we're looking at. So what is it? What's the adjective that Jesus used in this parable to describe the 5 bridesmaids who carried no oil with them? Foolish. So I want us to look at something. So can I have a volunteer to look up Matthew 5:22? Raise your hand so I know who's doing it. Okay, Carol. And someone Matthew 7:26. Kathy. And Matthew 23:17. Robert? Okay. So, Carol, would you read us Matthew 5:22? Okay, so here we see the word fool as being a pejorative that's given by someone who's actually doing wrong by doing that, right? Calling his brother or sister by that pejorative. Matthew 7:26, Kathy.
But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand.
And Matthew 23:17, Robert.
Ye fools and blind, which is greater, the gold or the temple that hath sanctified the gold?
Now, so we're looking at the author, which we believe to be Matthew, and we hear him use these words now in 4 places, 3 other places other than our text. And I want you to think about what each one does. So the one Carol gave us from Matthew 5:22, they says, whoever says you fool to their brother or sister is subject to hellfire. In other words, using it as a pejorative because this is a word that really does take away the Christian relationship between that person and their brother and sister, right? So what I would suggest here, in this case, the word fool is someone speaking from the wrong fidelity. So, what is fidelity? Fidelity is a faithfulness to someone or to something in which you're bound by a pledge or by duty, and it implies faithfulness to the obligation of that trust. So what, in fact, that brother or sister you're doing to that brother or sister is you're breaking fidelity by denigrating them and treating him in this manner, right? So in the second case, this comes from the end of the Mount, and we have the one who hears the words that Jesus has been proclaiming throughout this sermon, and this is the conclusion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and he says, anyone who hears these words today and doesn't act on them is like a foolish man who built his house on sand rather than on the solid rock. As we look at the larger text, we see it's the 2 ways, building on the rock or building on the sand. So that's building on the wrong foundation. So we have the wrong fidelity, the wrong foundation, and then the final one, which Robert had, he talks about blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold. And this comes into Jesus' discussion about oaths. And people say, well, you know, you may have made an oath on the temple, but I made an oath on the gold in the temple. Now, what would be significant about that? G-O-L-D, gold, like Goldfinger. Yeah.
Gold is a thing.
When Jesus is talking about making oaths, and he's talking about this difference between people who are making an oath based on the temple itself, or those who are basing their oath on the gold of the temple, and he says, which is greater? And the correct answer is the temple. Why? Right. So the temple is a sacred place, and it's the temple that makes the gold in it sacred. Now think about human thoughts, and people look at this temple and everything is gold. All this cedar has been covered with gold. And you go, people's mouths drop. And how much gold is there in this place? What's its value? And that's exactly what you should think when you hear what Jesus is saying. They're equating their focus. They have the wrong focus. They're equating what it's worth in monetary value when the temple itself is all about what God is doing. And this is a great text to go along. So if you're in a Bible study and you're talking about focus, what goes with this is you cannot serve God and mammon. And this text comes straight to it. Sometimes we think we're serving God, and yet we're focused on the things of men, on its human value in terms of economic or some other thing. And when we have the wrong focus, we come back to these 5 foolish women, and don't they have the wrong focus? So what do you think that focus might look like? What is their focus? Okay. Now, okay. Now, let's talk about the background for this. So, we just had a wedding. Still just been last month, right? So we had a wedding in the church, and Alan and Heather sent out their invitations, beautiful invitations, and we had worked for several months to get everything in preparation, and we knew it was going to happen at 2 o'clock on Saturday. We knew the date. We knew everything about it. Everything was planned, and especially if you have a wedding that's a big deal, they are planned in advance. They're put on the calendar. Everything is taken care of. There's invitations sent. There's clothes bought. There's all these kinds of things. And there are even shows about brides preparing for their weddings. Not exactly, it generally does not put them in the best light. That's a very good way of putting it. I was thinking of a way, since we're on the internet, how to put this. But this is exactly what happens. Now, a Jewish wedding in the first century didn't look like that. And I don't know if you've discussed this, but it makes it very helpful when you're reading through the Gospels to understand what's happening. So what would happen is, often families would be involved in arranging the marriage or whatever, but what would finally happen is the man would come and he would propose, in our modern sense, except it looked different. Because unlike most cultures in which the woman's family would give a dowry to attract the suitors, in Jewish culture, it was believed that since you had taken on a greater responsibility, because girls generally aren't as good field workers and those things as their sons, that in fact there was a bride price paid by the groom and his family to the bride's family. So what would happen is he would go and they would eat a meal, and finally the contract would be looked over. She might discuss it with her dad or whatever, but ultimately he would pour her a cup of wine. And the symbolism between this and the Last Supper just can't be ignored. And at that point, she can either consume it, in which she is now betrothed to him, or she can reject it. That's the first part. But the next thing is, he doesn't know when they're betrothed. They're almost married, except that do not live together yet. They're not married yet exactly, but it's more than engagement. And he goes back to prepare a place for her. But he doesn't know when he can come back. He goes and he builds a wedding chamber, a bridal chamber, at his dad's house. Now, young men have not changed in 2,000 years. So the first thought is, man, I've got some LG double-wide refrigerator boxes, and I can put together that little hut in about 45 minutes. Duct tape and LG refrigerator boxes, right? I know they were a little harder to find back then, but you get the idea. He didn't get to decide that the wedding chamber was prepared. Who made that decision? His father. No, the man's father said, now it is time you can go and get your bride. No one knows, not even the bridegroom, only the father knew when the time would come. And so when that time comes, he doesn't even know. And now we're in that point, when is he coming? But the other thing that we find out about marriages being the same, these are times of great celebrations and often feast and everything else. What do you think those 5 foolish bridesmaids were spending their time doing? They were enjoying the festivities. Obviously, these must have been some... but these are bridesmaids, not brides. Yeah. Yeah, he only got one, but the rest are bridesmaids. But so this is a big occasion. So this feast is something incredible, you can imagine. But they've, as important as they knew that great feast was, what do we find about the 5 foolish ones? Prepared or unprepared? Unprepared. The 5 wise ones were prepared. It is this preparation that we're really talking about, and what we're focused on in the Advent season. We are those who are prepared not for what has happened in the past. That is something that helps us prepare because we know what God has already done. But now we're prepared for the return of the bridegroom. And so Advent always looks to the incarnation, but recognizes the incarnation finds its fullness in the return of Christ to gather his own. You can't take out the incarnation with the cross and the resurrection, obviously, but you can't take away the return. Now, I want you to think about how our culture looks at the coming of Christ. So when we talk about our culture, what would our culture's viewpoint be if they believe in the coming of Christ? What would their first instinct be? Is that what most of our society is? I think it goes even more than that. In fact, I think, have any seen Red October? Now, the impact when Sean Connery says, in a place called Armageddon, and you can, I saw it at the theater, you can just feel the tension as people hear those words read from the Bible, right? From Revelation. It's a dread. Armageddon is a word that's used as a word of dread in our culture. Heard it a lot when I was in college and we were going through the nuclear freeze movement. Because obviously humanity only survives by humanity's wits and not by God's providence, according to our world. Please do not misquote me. There is a dread. Is that what Christians should feel? Now, if you think about what Armageddon is, it is the return of the king to fight the final conflict in which his reign is fully realized. You talk to 5 people off the streets, that's not their perspective about if it exists, that's not what they're looking at. They look at it with dread and horror. We're looking to it as being, finally, everything is being put right in its place. Christians are not afraid of the future. We're not afraid for ourselves of our future. I'm not saying that we're perfect and we never have any kind of anxiety or any of those. Don't get me wrong. If I can get rid of my own, then I can tell you that. We imperfectly live this out, but at the root of us, if we're a people of faith, is an expectation of what God is doing rather than always walking around in dread. Always walking around in worry. Those texts that we keep being irritated that Jesus had the audacity to tell us, don't worry. Consider the lilies of the field. I've considered them and I'm worrying anyway. No, that's not what we should be doing, even though we fall into that trap too often. So I want to talk about this wedding banquet one more time. So turn in your Bibles to chapter 22 of Matthew. And could I have somebody, chapter 22, Matthew, someone read the first 7 verses, please.
Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to summon those invited to the banquet, but they didn't want to come. Again, he sent out other servants and said, "Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fatted cattle have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet." But they paid no attention and went away, one to his own farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent out his troops, killed those murderers, and burned down their city.
And someone read 8 through 14, please.
Then he told his servants, "The banquet is ready, but those who were invited are not worthy. Go then to where the roads exist, exit the city, and invite everyone you find to the banquet." So those servants went out on the roads and gathered everyone they found, both evil and good. The wedding banquet was filled with guests. When the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed for a wedding. So he said to them, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, "Tie him up hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen."
Now Matthew comes back to this. Here we have the wedding feast again. And don't we also have someone shown who's also not prepared? He doesn't use the word foolish here, but we see the parallel between this and the 10 bridesmaids, right? So what is it that happened here in this parable of the great wedding feast? Okay, the invited didn't come, but everybody was then invited.
Good and evil.
Okay, so was the...
Just anyone off the street.
So here's the questions, and these are the questions that sometimes we gloss over when we read this parable. First of all, did it matter where the people came from that were called? No. It didn't matter at the beginning. It didn't matter at the end. What mattered? Okay. So first of all, we have those who rejected everything from the beginning.
Well, that's kind of an in-your-face rejection.
Yes. Now we have those who actually received the invitation and came. Are they all in the same category? No. What differentiates? Okay. Are you dressed in the wedding garments? So here's the issue. It didn't matter where they had been invited. It didn't matter what their past was, right? None of those things made the difference. The question was, have you now put on the wedding garments? Yes? Now, in my younger days, when I was a Methodist pastor, I actually, one Sunday, took off my Geneva gown and I put on the most tacky, tattered bathrobe. It wasn't hard to find. It's the one I used. Kathy will buy me a new one, but there's something about that terry cloth over time. Doesn't matter it has holes or everything else. So I put this on, and you could just see people, and they gasp. It's not that the wedding garment was not available for the man to put on. He had chosen to keep on his dirty rags. But it didn't even matter whether they were dirty rags. He could have been a rich man and had fine clothes, but he was not dressed for the occasion. It wasn't something that he had to go out and buy or go out and find. It was readily available. He thought that he could be part of this great wedding feast and remain totally unprepared. Right? Now, if you misread it, it's all about works righteousness. That's not what is being stated here. It's about receiving what is ours when we receive the invitation. There is a sense in which 20th and 21st century American Christianity has somehow distanced holiness from grace. They're not separate. And it's the separation that causes the problem. Because it makes everything either, all right, we do works, or we live by grace. Now, I got to tell you, that's not very good theology. Anybody know the theological name for that? Starts with an A. You want to tell them what antinomianism is?
Well, I'm trying to remember. Basically, it's this theory that if you're in a state of grace, you can do whatever you want to do.
And the problem I have for this, anyone who calls himself a Christian and a biblical Christian, is, should I sin all the more that grace may abound all the more? Who said that? Paul, the guy they keep claiming is preaching antinomianism. And he's not. And it's a misreading of Paul to say that he is. He's actually proclaiming a discipline. When Jesus calls on us, man, you read through the chapter 5 through 7 of Matthew in that Sermon on the Mount, you read through the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, you look at the later discourses in Matthew, Jesus preaches, a lot of it is, this then is how you shall live. In fact, the Sermon on the Mount gets you in trouble because he says, everything that was in the law doesn't go nearly far enough. And you can't, With man, it's impossible, but with God, this new